Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we are now streaming. So thank you so much for joining today's virtual panel. My name is Jeanne Ellis, and I'm the Senior Director for Water and Energy at DAI, and I am absolutely delighted to be moderating today's discussion. And this will be a discussion. We are not doing PowerPoint slides. We really want to get right into asking these questions and having this conversation on this important topic about the energy transition. So the goal of today's session is to examine the issue of supply chains and local workforce, specifically in the clean energy transition. Specifically, how can countries prepare their workers and enterprises to take advantage of the opportunities that the transition will enable while avoiding the pitfalls of previous natural resource development? So we are going to examine the issue from the perspective of donor, private sector, and implementer, and discuss the challenges, opportunities, and recommendations. And we're so privileged to have representatives from those three groups here on this panel. So I'm going to briefly introduce them, but I would also encourage you to go to the SID website as well as LinkedIn to see the impressive backgrounds and skills and experience that our panelists have. So first, starting with Jacqueline Musitwa, she's a senior climate finance advisor at USAID, charged to lead aid's mobilization of $150 billion in public and private finance. She's an international attorney specialized in business, human rights, and sustainability. She previously served in various leadership capacities, including in organizations such as Rio Tinto and the World Trade Organization. Jacqueline currently teaches at Georgetown and Cambridge, and she's published and been interviewed by various media outlets, including the Financial Times, CNBC Africa, and Newsweek. Next, we have Lauren Berry. She is the Vice President of Sustainability and External Affairs at Lapis Energy, which is a carbon management company, and she's going to speak to us about what that means. Lauren's primary charge is to ensure engagement and partnership with the communities where Lapis operates. Previously, Lauren led social performance partnerships at Ann Taylor, Cosmos, and Chevron. She's also the co-founder of Work, Life, Everything, an organization focused on building gender equity at home and at work. Finally, we have Patrick Henry. He is the president of Vice President of DAI Sustainable Business Group, which supports corporations in developing inclusive supply chains and impactful social development. His work focuses on bridging the gap between the supply chain demands of multinational companies and the ability of local suppliers to excel and secure contracts. Before joining DAI, Patrick held numerous senior executive roles, including Chief of Party for a USAID Supply Chain Development Program in Guyana. So with that, I would like to welcome the panelists and welcome our audience. And I'm going to try to leave some time at the end for questions. 50 minutes is going to go by very quickly, but I would say for our virtual attendees, please do put questions in the chat. My colleague Neil Borland is going to be monitoring that chat, and we will try to cover as many of those as we can at the end. So again, welcome Lauren, Jacqueline, and Patrick, and our audience members today. So let's first get into this topic. Jacqueline, I'm going to ask you to start us off, really looking at how these new renewable energy projects are starting to be conceptualized and developed. Can you talk about what you see as the main challenges and priority areas for building workforce and supply chains to help the Global South benefit from the energy transition? And perhaps if you can bring in an example or two from how USAID is supporting these initiatives. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit more about the work that we're doing. I think just for context, the United States Agency for International Development is the largest global aid organization. And we do many things, but focusing at least on the climate pillar where I sit, energy transition and energy access are a big priority. Under our new climate strategy, which came out in 2022, one of the priorities there was really to focus on the reduction of 6 billion metric tons of CO2. And we see our role within the energy transition kind of connecting to that reduction in CO2. We also do have a prioritization of methane reduction, which is increasingly more important within our portfolio. The last two things I'll say, at least with respect to the climate strategy, are that we do focus on critical populations. And so that does include women, that does include Indigenous people, youth, and other historically marginalized people. And then also there's the question of how do we get to the respective goals within the energy transition? And that is kind of my portfolio of the 150 billion. From where I sit, I will at least focus this kind of high level of what we're doing. We do work closely, at least from a DC perspective, with our colleagues in Power Africa. I'd like to zero in on Africa just because we do have a specialized team working there, and they do have a very strong history of delivery, not only of megawatts on the continent, but also other related climate benefits. I think some of the challenges that at least I've seen working with them on the African context, but that also come up in different geographies, is this question of kind of pipeline. What are countries really able to create as far as bankable projects, and how is capital able to kind of meet those respective demands? Definitely a lot coming online with respect to renewable energy projects, in particular solar. But the question is, what is happening within the transmission space and what's happening within the distribution space? And there are questions around investment and also upskilling, as a lot of the public utilities really are trying to grapple with aging infrastructure and how best to modernize it. Another aspect that we're seeing, especially as we talk about the just energy transition, is the question of how do we move from old skills within the mining sector, and in particular coal, to new skills within the green economy, and really wondering who is going to pay for the upskilling, reskilling, retooling of people within those spaces. How do we ensure that the transition is equitable for all people within those communities? And how do we make sure that the benefits of moving green also trickle down, and we don't make the mistakes that we made in the past with other transitions? The last thing that I'll say is kind of one of, can I say, broader questions around the system. How do we make sure that as we work with different countries, we're able to take a systemic view and lens of the work, not only looking at these challenges from a supply chain perspective or an energy perspective, but really looking holistically at governance of the system. So we do provide capacity building, for instance, to partner governments to make sure that as they look to transition to the green economy, they do have the legal and regulatory infrastructure in place. In addition to that, we also provide grants, and the grants are usually to partner organizations within those countries, really to work on aspects of supporting improving skills, but also creating an ecosystem that allows a country to transition to green. And so I'll go ahead and stop there and kind of continue with the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Jacqueline. Yes, you really sort of set the stage at a macro level, talking about the systems, the governance, the ecosystems. So now I'd like to zoom in a little bit to Lauren from the corporate perspective. Lapis Energy is focused domestically on the US, but I know you also have tremendous experience working on energy projects across the globe, sitting in the private sector side. Can you talk about what you see as the main challenges and priority areas for energy companies in helping to build out your workforce and supply chains? And if there are sort of lessons from your work in the US that you think could be applied to the global South or vice versa, that would be helpful to hear your insights on that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeannie, and thanks for having us today. Great to be reconnected with you all. So Lapis Energy, as Jeannie mentioned, we are a Dallas-based carbon management company. We focus on carbon capture sequestration. Most of us actually came out of the oil and gas sector. So the founders all came from Cosmos Energy, which was a frontier oil and gas explorer working primarily in the Atlantic margin, which was so most of our experience, which I'm glad Jacqueline's focusing on Africa as well. Most of our experiences was really in West Africa and Latin America. But the guys who have these really extensive subsurface geological skills took that skill set from the oil and gas sector and are applying it to carbon capture sequestration here in the US. Why are we focused on the US, even though we're all international folks? It's because really of the commercial opportunities that are in the US, thanks to a host of initiatives from the Biden administration, which we can certainly dig into more later. But it's really about the commercial opportunities here in the US, thanks to some of the incentives that the administration has introduced. What is carbon capture sequestration briefly? Essentially, again, we're mostly geologists here. I'm a social scientist, but most of these guys are geophysicists and geoscientists. And we're focused on finding the storage reservoirs here in the US that where you can essentially store CO2. And so our focus is decarbonization. So once we find these fabulous storage reservoirs for CO2, where you can put CO2 1 to 2 miles underground, we then pair that storage facility with an emitter. So our customers are really industrial clients in hard to abate sectors. So these are ammonia facilities, refineries, power plants, cement factories, you name it. We pair these guys that they're trying to reduce their CO2 with these storage reservoirs where we sink the CO2 through the CCS process. So Lapis, again, I'll really put on my hat from both kind of my previous oil and gas experience with today working in the US, and try to share a little bit of insights from both. So the one thing I'll say is that, I've been with this company for about 7 months now, but spent 15 years in oil and gas. The workforce and supply challenges are actually pretty similar in the sense that from a workforce perspective, one of our biggest challenges within energy has been that you have, we always want to show that we're creating jobs, right? But in terms of how an energy project is developed, you end up having, very few jobs, and then you have a spike when you have a construction phase for an energy project. And then you have an operations mode where you have a very few jobs at the end of the day. So part of the kind of big picture challenge, which I'm sure Patrick will speak to as well, is how do you think about training up a workforce where you have these big peaks and valleys? Clean energy has the same challenge in terms of how much do you invest in the training of a workforce when you have these peaks and valleys. And then also thinking about, from a private sector lens, the added challenge is in terms of your permitting schedule. How do you pair up your hiring and recruitment and training, all of these strategies, when there's a lot of uncertainty around permitting timelines? And specific to the CCS universe, and I think our friends in renewables are in a very similar place, part of what comes along with these fabulous incentives from the government are a lot of very stringent new requirements that you have to work through to get your permit. So pairing your kind of permitting timeline with your hiring and training timeline is a real challenge for, I think, both traditional energy sector as well as the clean energy sector. The other piece I'll just mention, this is kind of a boring one, is just competition for talent. So, that's always going to be a challenge. And I will say that the clean energy space and the traditional energy space, we are competing for a lot of the same folks. I think that's always going to be an issue, but that's just certainly in the US, that's the environment that we're working in. The other thing I'll say, I've worked in these huge energy companies like Chevron to a kind of mid-sized company of Cosmos. Now I'm at a little baby startup of 26 people. And I will say that one of the things that I'm now kind of empathizing a different way with all the SMEs out there that I've worked with in the past, which is we really want to access a lot of the incentives, and the DOE has tons of grants and loans and fabulous things that they're offering, but a very small company to kind of break through and access that kind of financing, there's a huge, I mean, you have to hire staff to help write the grant applications. And then the process itself can take years to turn around before you actually see that money, which in a way, if you're not a big company, can crowd out the very small players that I think some of these incentives are hoping to stimulate. And I would imagine that's happening in the US. I can imagine that that's happening internationally as well. So and these are the very programs that are really intended to localize workforce and community, intended to localize supply chain. It's very hard to tap into some of those funds. The other thing I'll just quickly mention is around labor mobility, which is, we saw this internationally, I'm seeing it here in the US, is that you, on the one hand, are training up workforce. Is that a community, we talk about community local content versus national content. One of the things that I worry about is I'm working in a lot of small towns where you can see, especially if they're an oil and gas town, a lot of their talent, their young workforce has left the small town to go work in other places, which leaves, small towns of elderly residents, a small tax base, failing schools. So part of what we have to think about, and I think Jacqueline was alluding to this as well, is sort of like just not to the workforce picture, but sort of the whole community picture and how we plan these workforce strategies to really think that in that more kind of holistic, big picture impact way, rather than just pure job creation. Really quick, I'll just mention that I think we have a lot. I hope that USAID and other donors are paying attention to the Biden administration and all the things they're doing around creating incentives for this work. So I'm going to leave it to Jacqueline to touch more on kind of, I hope what the international community is learning from what's going on here in the US, which is really at the center of a lot of interesting policy experiments. But I think the thing that I'm learning, having come from the international side, and what perhaps concerns me the most, is that in the US, we're very far behind the international community in terms of practitioners and how we think about bringing in community voice and community participation into some of these decisions. I think internationally, I think we maybe have some challenges on implementation, but the guidelines are there in terms of how do we talk to community about the workforce they want to help build, about supply chain issues. In the US, our community consultation is driven by very particular environmental permitting kind of processes, which ends up resulting in basically the loudest, most powerful, influential voices having the most say in which projects get done. So it's not necessarily an equitable process in terms of how we do things in the US. So I'll stop there.
Oh, that's great, Lauren. Thank you. And I think that's a great segue into turning it to Patrick. Your team, the Sustainable Business Group, as socioeconomic advisors, you really sit at the intersection between the corporate sector and the donors and governments of our host countries. So first, do you see any challenges or priorities that haven't been mentioned by Lauren or Jacqueline? Then also, how do you find that sort of alignment or bridge the gaps where there are between private sector developer interests and government and community interests? Over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Jeannie. For those folks that don't know, I know it's a SID conference, but the group that I lead at DAI directly works for energy companies around the globe, in Africa and other parts of the world, as well as in the United States, because largely what Lauren's talking about with the Biden administration, right? So there's a little bit of I'll use some terms quickly, but local content is developing a local workforce and local suppliers. It's what energy companies call kind of developing supply chains and workforce. Different parts of the world call it in-country value, and the Biden administration calls it community benefits plans. So there's this push for, how do we make a plan and then follow that plan to develop a workforce and suppliers? And, it's interesting. A lot of the ideas touched on, from our end, or what we're seeing kind of with our clients is, it's an aging workforce across the world that worked in kind of traditional hydrocarbons or oil and gas. And that workforce is in competition for this energy transition. A lot of it is the same skills. It just has to be recalibrated. operating, a refinery running on hydrogen or operating a refinery running on natural gas is similar and can be transitioned. So it's interesting with our clients of they're grappling with a little bit of not only the workforce for the energy transition, but kind of continuing to run their current assets around the globe. And so there's a lot of that. There's also, as you move into kind of frontier markets and develop large energy projects, be it traditional or renewable, you're going to local content or the ability to have a local supply chain is what is there at the time that the project gets built. It takes a long time to develop suppliers and workforce. So, there is a role or it has to be thought through with donor partners and others of what's the next tier that gets built, or how does this kind of pool from large energy projects, no matter what they are, get replaced in the economy. You can't bankrupt one sector of the economy for this kind of transition and what's occurring. So I think that's kind of a key thing for people to understand, is that this kind of the CapEx and OpEx phase that Lauren talks about, the people best able to take advantage of a CapEx phase are the businesses and the workforce are the ones that are probably already trained. As they get trained and then work into that sector, they suddenly become globally competitive, right? So if you look at the traditional oil and gas sector, anywhere in the world, it's extremely diverse because the workforce and the suppliers are following those companies that are rather massive around the globe. And so suddenly local content that got built in Nigeria is sitting in Guyana, and working for oil and gas companies there. So it's grappling with this idea, kind of Lauren had touched on it, of, local communities getting upskilled and then that workforce departing. It follows the same pattern in Africa of companies being upskilled, becoming competitive is what you want, right? You're trying to get companies globally competitive and you're trying to get workforce globally competitive. And then once they are, then they truly are global, and you see it in the energy sector more than you do in others. So I think those are some of the policy decisions that have to be thought through, and some of the policy choices of, when a government's looking at local content, how do they use local content this time around, right? Previously in the mining sector and the oil and gas sector, it was built to support that sector. How do you think of policy to think across the economy? What are the transferable skills that renewable energy is going to build that can stay in the country, right? Do you want as much specialization as maybe got driven in the past to build a sector that kind of ensures that you get this kind of broad economic growth, that you pull in communities in the past, that you transition kind of the old sector, if it's coal or something like that, into the new sector, but also understand that by doing that, you're going to build globally competitive suppliers and workforce in your own country that then you're competing with others in the world who also need those skills that might not have.
Thanks, Patrick. And yeah, as we speak about local content or in-country value, then I think sort of the next part of that discussion is how do we make it more inclusive and equitable? So probably a number of people on the call today have heard the term the just energy transition. That can mean a lot of different things to different people, and depending on the context where you're operating. But what I'd ask the panel to really talk to us about is the just energy transition vis-a-vis workforce and supply chain. So specifically, how can we help ensure that vulnerable and underrepresented groups, including women, are able to take advantage of these new job and business opportunities that the transition to these new energy sources and technologies may provide? So I'd like to turn it first to Lauren. Given your work both domestically and overseas, what do you see the ways the goal of the just energy transition are being tackled, and what can we learn from how it's being done so far and from the US versus overseas context? And then as you see sort of appropriate, if you could bring in, what you found from the research and engagement that you've been doing with your work life, everything research organization that helps promote women participation and benefits from the energy sector. So over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Jeannie. So just, I mean, I think probably most of the callers here know about what a just energy transition, sort of what we're referring to, but in some, I mean, essentially it's that in this energy transition, we don't leave people behind. And different organizations have different definitions of what that actually looks like. I'll say that now that I'm working here in the US, there's a heavy focus on environmental justice, again, which has its own background and history, but there's a unique focus on making sure that communities that have been burdened by industry, specifically pollution, the kind of negative externalities of industry, that they're not burdened again, overburdened by anything we do in the new energy space. So all of that's to say, when it comes to workforce and supply chain, one thing that, Patrick's group and others, the first thing you do, yes, you have in the US, it's a community benefits plan. Internationally, it's a local content plan. Is the first thing you want to do, just make sure that you are actually considering, not just what's convenient or cost effective, but we're going to take a look at what labor we can hire locally, what supply chain companies we can hire locally. And again, it's interesting to start getting into, especially in the US, what do you consider local? Is it local to the community? Is it local to the state? Do we just mean Americans? So in each place you work, you're going to have a very different set of definitions. So that's just kind of, for me, I hope it doesn't always happen this way, but I feel like that's just kind of like table stakes at this point, is you do that kind of assessment to make sure that you're utilizing the folks that you can in your workforce and supply chain. The more complicated bit comes in when you start looking at the additional dollars that get spent developing workforce and supply chain. Because I do think we sometimes can get fixated on just the jobs numbers. Essentially what's happening is you have companies that are trying to satisfy and your local elected officials and community members who want to hear, my project is going to create 1,000 direct jobs and 2,000 indirect jobs, and they want those numbers to attach to. I think I would love if we can also kind of just pull the lens back and think about kind of dollar for dollar spend. If you're putting additional money into a community project, where is that dollar best spent to develop, to help with local economic development? So as an example, outside of the US, I worked with DAI previously at Cosmos Energy, where we were a non-operator in Ghana, and rather than invest a ton of money, for instance, let's create a scholarship program where we send 4 people to go study in Texas, something around geosciences. We took that same amount of money and invested it into an agricultural training program, because the economics of it in terms of the long-term impact of that investment was much greater in agriculture than it was going to be in specifically an energy related job. So after you get through that initial assessment of what can we do locally, I think it's worth us, we do get fixated on the jobs numbers. It's worth kind of pulling the lens back and looking at community development. Where can dollar for dollar you have the most impact? The other thing I'll just say on, how do you think about vulnerable, underrepresented, we talk about marginalized groups. I think in the US and abroad, one thing we also, we kind of have our little categories and check boxes. We don't talk enough about class. So we talk about geography a lot, but there's a piece of it, which is what happens when you, again, just focus on, is this person from the right place? What you can do is sometimes you can end up benefiting the 0.0001% of kind of wealthy people in a particular place, versus looking at how do we actually try to hire from a broad cross-section that includes class, right? So for instance, I have a very close colleague that's working on a workforce development program in the US that takes homeless youth and puts them on track for clean energy jobs. So these are the kind of out of the box kind of thinking that we want to do when we think about whole community impacts. One thing I'll just say is you know that I'm very passionate about getting more women into the energy sector. Everybody will talk about this is an issue about STEM training, getting more women into STEM. I think that's important, but I don't think that's at the root of the issue. I think in the energy sector, it's a cultural issue where you have mostly men historically dominating the sector. And because it's a cultural problem, it's a cultural solution. Little things like, you know, at the very top, when you think about leadership, I'm in Texas, Louisiana, like there's hunting retreats. I can't tell you how many women have had to learn how to hunt or golf to participate at a leadership level in the energy sector in the US, which I think is a little silly. So how do we actually not just have these really rich women's networks in the energy sector, but actually reach beyond that and have men who are, you know, in leadership positions pulling women into their leadership experiences? That's from the top. From the bottom up, there's a real childcare crisis in our country, in the US, that is preventing women at all levels from participating in their kind of top performance mode in the sector. And so again, the Biden administration is trying to kind of blend some of these issues, and for instance, trying to have childcare incentives for some of the new factories that are being built to create affordable childcare as part of the facilities. I think that's great, but I also, again, putting my international cap on, we don't want companies only, you don't want to have your childcare kind of public good just reliant on private sector solutions. So that needs to be paired with government solutions on childcare that will help keep women in the workforce, including in the energy sector.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And yeah, talking about those sort of government solutions leads to my next question to Patrick, which is, you've already mentioned it, the Inflation Reduction Act here in the US, which is incentivizing companies to invest in renewable energy technology. So from there, can you sort of talk about this issue, particularly from the policy perspective, and how policies and governments can sort of impact this push towards more equity and inclusion in these new energy projects? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I think it's interesting from the perspective, probably until the Inflation Reduction Act and the kind of industrial policy that got passed under the Biden administration, this idea of local content policy and legislation was really driven in the global South, right? It was ensuring that the resources that were going to be extracted benefited local communities. And those policies kind of pushed the limits of what was globally acceptable, I think, at those times by under trade agreements and other things of how you localize supply chains and workforces. And the kind of big kind of sea change in that space really has been the Inflation Reduction Act that kind of, with these investments in renewable energy, is demanding legislatively that kind of disadvantaged communities are pulled into this transition, so that it might not be necessarily trying to get the businesses from those communities into the projects, but how do you support workforce and other pieces of a community that kind of historically has been disadvantaged. So it's an interesting policy framework, and as you know, policy goes around the world, there's often people, countries, and governments and policymakers will start to follow the others. So it's interesting from kind of where I sit, as we've advised both governments and industry on kind of local content policy or in-country value policy. You kind of see the Gulf countries, doing in-country value, which is trying to utilize resources to diversify out of kind of traditional oil and gas. And now you see the kind of US and the European Union following of, incentivizing kind of historically disadvantaged communities in that, right? And I think you'll see that wave of kind of legislation and policy go into what you're seeing in the developing world.
Yeah, so you and Lauren have spoken quite a bit about the U.S. context and how, Patrick, you're saying this may translate into other policies internationally. So, Jacqueline, can you talk to us about the international context of that? What is USAID's position on the just transition, and how are you working to promote inclusive and equitable energy development?
I'll start by saying, I mean, a few years ago, this is COP26, when the just energy transition framework kind of came out supporting the transition in Indonesia, Vietnam, and South Africa as the initial 3 countries to kind of focus on. The US government was on board and supportive of those transitions, in part due to the high emissions within those countries and the potential for them to transition from coal, but also as an example of how we can do development better. How do we use the opportunity effectively to better collaborate with other donors, engage the private sector at an earlier time than we usually do, but also ultimately making sure that we had local buy-in into those processes. I've worked most closely on the South African transition, and I think some lessons to date, just really delve well into what Lauren was saying. The aspect of community participation and voice is really important. And one of the criticisms that came out of South Africa was when the JET-P program was set up, there wasn't enough consultation. So a plan was made at a government level, was negotiated globally, but local communities, especially in Mpumalanga, where a majority of coal reserves are in South Africa, were not consulted. So since then, a lot of what has been happening has been not only localized dialogue on how to think about the future of a transition, but also national dialogue, making sure other relevant stakeholders kind of take part. I mean, I absolutely agree with Lauren. There are lots of good lessons to learn about community engagement, how to get buy-in. I think the challenge we're seeing not only in the JET-P area of work, but I think more holistically in development, whether we look at large-scale ag or other areas, is this notion of who is the community and who is most relevant to engage and to get buy-in with is I think still a hard one. I think another aspect of it is this idea of incentives. Who is providing incentives and when? From a JET-P perspective, the donors really came in to say we can support with skills rebuilding and retooling. But what that did is, once again, it took us back to kind of siloed areas of work where government said, we will work on the finance, you donors, as well as philanthropy, go to skills. And it was kind of a disjointed plan, which has resulted in great small pilots, but not really a large scale push to what happens next for people within those areas. The result of that has been a huge pushback from the mining sector, really kind of saying, one, now is not the time, especially considering the lack of jobs in South Africa. Two, considering the fact that Eskom, the largest public utility there, is having challenges and there are rolling blackouts around the country. Now is not the time to decommission coal plants. There needs to be an and option, not a sole option of the transition. So once again, that pushback has now led to the political conversation changing a bit from what it was a few years ago and really just becoming more practical. So I think the lesson there also is just understanding that as we embark on the just transition and trying to be more inclusive, making sure that unions of different sorts are included, but also different sorts of community groups, there's the reality that things are changing, situations are changing, and countries end up making the choices that matter most for where they are in their development context. So the conversations that we're seeing now in South Africa public media of really focusing on making sure that ESCOM continues to be a functioning utility, sometimes is at odds with our goals of getting to a just transition. I think what's also interesting to note across many developing countries is we're not solely talking about transition. In many cases, we are actually talking about energy access. How do we make sure that people who are off the grid get on the grid? How do we make sure that people do have productive use of electricity? And we're also having that conversation at a time that we're also talking about industrial scale power. And so I think it's important just to understand that in many developing countries, there is this continuum. And as we look at that continuum, it means that we are engaging different stakeholders at different times, but we're equally dedicating different amounts of funding and support to many different levels. I think the challenge we face as USAID is there are limited public dollars for all of the work we're doing. And so how do we really create an enabling environment that is able to attract the private sector to invest in these economies so we can shift the burden from donors or the state to really more of a partnership with the private sector. The last thing I'll say just around kind of aspects of just is, I mean, we do work very closely with International Labor Organization. We do work very closely through our own localization agenda and prioritization to make sure that we kind of create a definition of what is just within each setting we're looking at, just to make sure that we are able to capture what decent work might look like, not only at a project development state, but also kind of in an ongoing development context. I think the ILO as a partner has been great, just, you know, not only in our own programming at a local level, but also as we design our financing structures. So as an example, last year, USAID, together with our Nordic partners, in particular Denmark, worked together on a blended finance for energy transition initiative that was focused on Asia. It's a $1.4 billion transaction. And while we were structuring that, there was a lot of dialogue with partners like the ILO to really make sure that we included aspects of just into this so that as we work on investing across Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and other countries in Southeast Asia, that was a component that the funders that we were going to give our money to were able to adhere to. I think the last part that I'll say is really for us, and I think this also goes back to Lauren's point, how do we go beyond just the numbers to making sure that there is visible impact and people's lives are changed in the process? And so part of that for us is making sure that we, as a donor, obviously continue to engage the communities where we are, but we also do, through our own localization targets, make sure that as we design projects, as we disperse money, we are working with more local entities so that the work can be sustainable over the long term.
Great. Thank you, Jacqueline. A lot covered there. And yeah, it was interesting to hear the lessons that you have seen both from the US and coming from the Global South. So thank you for that. I am conscious of time. I do want to take some questions. I had another question, but I want to take a question or two from the audience if we can. So I see we've got one here. I think directed perhaps primarily to Lauren, but others, Jacqueline and Patrick, if you have thoughts on this as well, please jump in. So the question is, in light of the challenges we have in integrating more women into the male-dominated energy sector internationally, could you share any strategies you've employed in the US to enhance women's participation in the workforce and supply chains, but also inclusion in stakeholder engagement and communities, with communities?
I'll just say really quickly, because I'd love to hear from the other folks, that I think it actually starts with really good community consultation and stakeholder engagement to understand who are the potential women workforce participants, supply chain participants. And one thing that I've particularly been learning here in the US is looking at community caregivers will tap you into women-owned businesses, future women employees, for example, engaging with parent-teacher associations, engaging with daycares. These are places where you get a different group of women that you necessarily will find at your local chamber of commerce. So I would say get creative in terms of where women are in communities that you can tap into them as resources. And then paired with that, when you think about where there are situations where for women to enter the workforce or supply chain and training is required, everywhere in the world, US and every place I've worked internationally, women will be caretaking in their community, whether that's their parents, their aunts and uncles, or children. And so you have to make sure that your training program provides and fits within the schedule of a full-time caregiving role. And so that can include, for instance, providing on-site childcare at your training facility where you're training women for whatever skill you're trying to put into your workforce or supply chain. So just use your best social scientist hat and try to put yourself in the shoes of a future female employee or supply chain participant.
Yeah, I'll kind of add to that. Kind of Lauren had talked about it. I mean, when you start or launch a large energy project, you kind of have to understand what the baseline is. You also understand the demand that project's going to create. And in doing that, you can try to target businesses that are women-owned or businesses that are kind of led by minority groups in an area to kind of spread the benefit. So, you have a large demand from an energy project. It's building the supply to match that as quickly as possible and getting them in. And then they get to grow along with that project. They get to grow along with the CapEx phase. They get to move into the OpEx phase. They get to benefit from the ripple effect through the larger economy. But it is a targeted approach that you're trying to reach them, and there's an opportunity for them to make the investment in time, like Lauren said, but also in their business to kind of upskill and win the work. And it's attainable, and you can do it. And I think that's an approach that really can overcome that hurdle, is a purposeful approach to doing it and getting them in.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say is, for instance, we know that our partnering with us is tricky. It's bureaucratic, it's heavy. And that is something on kind of the back end of USAID that we are working on, is really trying to make partnership more accessible. We do have a private sector engagement hub, which is one of the great kind of first stops to go to if you are interested in partnering with USAID. So they can at least walk you through the process for you to understand what to do. Having said that, I think when I work with partners who are daunted by the process and kind of like breathe, it will take time. And if you do have a small team, it is worth at least doing it with 2 people, so you do have more knowledge and capacity internally. And then our teams are also able to work with you. I found that through Development Innovation Ventures, which is our kind of ventures arm, which provides smaller grants to organizations, their processes are kind of a bit easier and more nimble. So I think it's also finding where within USAID or within USG you can start out based on the size of your business, and then once you're in, kind of expand that. I've also found that, for a lot of partners who continue to do great work and who continue to scale their businesses, it really is just a matter of learning the system and growing up. But having said that, I do acknowledge it is hard, and that is something we are working on. It is hard because of the accountability we have to the American people and making sure that taxpayer money is used effectively. But we also do want to make sure that our systems are not discriminating against different groups, especially ones that should be accessing our money the most. Over.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I realize I'm getting a message from the technical moderator that we're just about out of time, but I would like to give each of you the opportunity to give, say, one recommendation to our audience here in terms of how we can continue to improve the equitable inclusion of the workforce and supply chains in this energy transition. So perhaps I'll go Lauren, Patrick, and then Jacqueline, give you the last word.
I'll say one thing we didn't touch on too much today, but I think is so important is, again, not just numbers and not even just impact, but that for kind of long-term local to national development, we also have to talk about power dynamics, who's making decisions, and that's a real indicator for me of success is if key decision makers are from the places that you're trying to benefit, rather than just serving a larger purpose, a larger project, a larger organization, then I think that's a measure of success that we need to look at is who's the leadership, who's the decision makers, and if you're on the side of developing a program, do you have an exit plan to make sure that you're not going to stay in that role?
I think from my end, it's just to take the opportunity that the transition is going to afford to kind of ensure that there's dialogue for kind of previous disadvantaged communities, that you pool those communities into these processes and projects so that they can hear their voice, but also that they can benefit from the kind of economic windfall that's going to come from this, from businesses to workforce, and so that it really is kind of dialogue and kind of restructuring the way you think about this kind of from a policy perspective.
Jacqueline.
And I think from my end is I'm looking at this process almost like doing yoga. We are all being stretched in different ways, and sometimes it hurts, but there are ultimately long-term benefits. So as we go through the transition, how do we make sure we meet everyone with where they are, with their capacities, with their deficiencies, and really try to make sure that we have a more inclusive, genuinely, authentically inclusive dialogue that really allows people to participate, but also receive the benefits. I think for our failure to do that will result in negative repercussions for us all. We are all interconnected, and I think that it's important that we look at this as a holistic picture. I saw a comment in the chat that, you know, Africa didn't cause a lot of the climate challenges we're experiencing today, yet is experiencing the brunt. And it is precisely for that reason that everyone has to play a role to make sure that we do all collectively get to a better place on Earth. Over.
Well, thank you. I think that's a perfect note to end this session on. And I'd like to thank the three panelists, Lauren, Jacqueline, Patrick. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to the audience members who have joined and to SID Washington for hosting us. Thank you all and have a good day.
Bye, thank you.